Hey, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Matthew. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about fractional reserve banking, the reserve ratio, and recessions. And we're going to do so through the lens of the Canadian banking system. So, what we're going to talk about today, hopefully with some brevity, is the Canadian financial system, the Canadian banking system, and the reserve ratio. I'm not going to do a whole seminar on fractional reserve banking and the reserve ratio here. I just want to show you it, and I'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, so here we have base money in banks. To find out exactly what base money is, check out the prior video. Base money in banks is just those same bank reserves, those settlement balances, the account that each bank holds with the central bank, plus a little bit of cash and coin that is actually in the bank vaults, available for withdrawal if a depositor wants to do so. So this is system-wide. You see that there's just an explosion from COVID. But before then, really the whole time, a little bit higher in the 80s, but really the whole time, there's not too much base money in the banks, certainly relative to today. And then banking, the nature of banking is basically banks take deposits. Unfortunately, it's a monopolistic business. Neither you nor I can set up a bank ad hoc. We have to go through a very rigorous, horrible, painful process by regulators to set up a bank. But basically, the way that banking works is that depositors want to post their funds somewhere in a safe place. They post their funds, they deposit their funds in a safe place, and the bank, of course, while those funds are sitting idle, will lend the majority of those funds out. That's how banking works. It's not a secret. It's never been a secret. So I'm going to show you those funds right now. Those are called the demand deposits. And here it is. We can see that it dwarfs the value of base money in banks, whereas base money in banks, even when we went to COVID times, was a few $100 billion. You see the base money in banks got to $387 billion or so at the height of COVID. And what that means is, while there's more base money in banks, that's kind of the raw material that banks have as reserve to make loans. And Canada, like many systems in the world, does not have a reserve ratio. So they could technically, theoretically, lend as much as they want on top of this. There's no limit. Absolutely, practically no limit to do so. That's just how banking works. Whether that's a good idea, whether that bank is safe or not safe, that's a completely different question. I'm just explaining how banking works. So the deposits sit here at a very, very much higher multiple. So again, to finish the thought that I started with, $390 billion or so in base money at this point, peak COVID, and the peak demand deposits actually came a little bit after that. You see there's a lag, about 1.4 trillion Canadian dollars outstanding in demand deposits as of early 2022, about a year ago. Okay, and it has fallen. Both have fallen since then. All right, so basically, these are not stacked. This is just one laid on top of the other. The ratio of the base money in banks, all right, which is basically the bank reserves, that's the high-powered money. Cash and coin in as well, but it's typically a smaller amount. And then the outstanding demand deposits, the ratio of those two things is the reserve ratio. Now I'm going to show that on the right axis. Okay. So we see a few different things here. First of all, in the 60s, late 60s, 70s, and 80s, only, unfortunately, the best data that I have at this point. I do intend on analyzing the Canadian system, many systems way back into the 19th century, even farther back if I can. Canada, as I discussed in the last video, has been a historically and benchmark interesting free banking economy prior to 1935, no central bank. But at this point, times were pretty uncertain, actually, in the economy. Paul Volcker took interest rates at 20%, as I've talked about in prior videos. The Bank of Canada also increased interest rates. We'll show those in the future. Times were uncertain. There were some recessions in the early 80s in Canada, as well as many places around the world. But interestingly, you see what happens here is before the recession, the reserve ratio was rising, okay? And after the recession, the reserve ratio was falling. Now, just to put this in perspective, we have to weave through a few different things, because when we talk about banking, particularly fractional reserve banking, as my old co-host Fernando liked to say, it's like quicksand. People really get locked up in this idea that it's fraudulent or it's not right or you shouldn't do it, whatever. The main problem here is that we have a central bank. Okay, we can't analyze at least this period, which is the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, into COVID here. We can't analyze this period and not make the blatant observation that a central bank is taking part. But we can maybe make some interesting conclusions about this central bank taking part in the economy if we look at some other economies with slightly different regulations, so on and so forth, like the United States economy, which I've done a lot. See some of the links in the prior videos for the different money supplies, talking about demand deposits, so on and so forth. So we have to weave through a few different things. I certainly contend that a decentralized, free banking system is better than the system that we have, but we don't have that anymore. It's part of the reason why we need Bitcoin, because we just don't have it anymore. But we can still make some interesting observations. So, number one, a recession did happen here in the early 80s. Also, interest rates were rising. But the reserve ratio, meaning the ratio of that backstop in case people want to come withdraw their money, to the amount of demand deposits outstanding. And remember, banks by their very nature, it's not a crime. They lend out those demand deposits, the vast majority, and that becomes an asset for the bank. Liability for the bank is the demand deposit, but the loans themselves are an asset for the bank. It's rising here. The reserve ratio is rising. So theoretically, their buffer is getting stronger, yet they still had a recession. Okay. Now look what happened after. All right. From the early 80s, someone figured out something here in the Central Bank of Canada and the system and some of the regulations. Again, Canada does not have a reserve ratio. Actually, I'm not sure if I just said that in this video or not, but Canada does not have a reserve ratio. Contrast that to south of the border in the United States. They do have a reserve ratio for the largest banks. They don't for the smallest banks in the United States. And actually, since COVID, since March of 2020, there is no reserve ratio in the United States either. A lot of things have gone haywire from COVID, kind of like a lot of things went haywire from the global financial crisis. But Canada can show us some interesting differences, okay? So there was no reserve ratio. So even though the reserve ratio was increasing just before a recession up to 23%, very safe levels, all right, in the 60s and the 70s, had a recession, the Canadian banking system in total started to decrease that, all right, meaning more deposits outstanding per base money in the banks, to where by 1990, you're all the way down to 5% of a reserve ratio from 20. All right, just 10 years prior. Go to 2000. Okay, you have this Y2K fear that happens all the time. That little bump, that's what that is. But right around 2000, the normalized reserve ratio is about 1%. Okay, only 10 years after 1990 there, when it was 5. Then we go to 2010. Even under 1%, a little bit above actually when the global financial crisis happened. And then on the eve of COVID here, the reserve ratio was 0.1%. All right. And let's just move it around so you can see how it jumps. It's well below 1%, well below even 0.5% reserve ratio. Okay. So what can we conclude from this? And again, I want to bring your attention to Canada did not have a recession during the global financial crisis. There was no banking panic. Again, no banks failed, unlike the US. No banks failed in the Great Depression, unlike the US. So we have this situation where, yes, demand deposits are rising. The base money is falling. Also, keep in mind, base money is just a ledger entry. It's just the full faith and credit of the central bank. That's all that it is. Those reserves that you hold, the backstop for your demand deposits. So it's very, very small. What was the central bank itself signaling to the market, particularly after 2000? Well, they were signaling they weren't even really a fan of gold. Now, that's unlike most banks and actually all the banking system throughout humanity. It's only been 50 years that we have had no connection to gold or silver. Canada, as well as the UK, signaled in the early 2000s that they were going to sell most or even all of their gold. The UK, Brown's Bottom, it was called. I did a prior video about this. See the link in the show notes. They reversed that. They ended up buying some more gold here. Canada, as far as I know, I haven't checked actually the most recent statistics, but they have not reversed it. Canada doesn't hold any gold, which is a very unique thing actually for a big developed nation. So Canada is a little bit unique in that perspective, and that was the decision by the executives at the central bank that they don't need that gold. I'm a fan of gold. I think the market is generally a fan of gold. That's why, particularly right now at this moment, you see gold increasing in value while the risk of price inflation increases around the world. But look, Canada did not have a crisis here in 2008. They did start to get a property bubble later. All right. And now, as I mentioned in the last video, they have joined the craziness of the rest of the world by, because of COVID, exploding their reserves. And thus, also, you see that broader money, demand deposits are included in broader money, explode as well. So there's a few different things, again, you have to weave through here. First of all, we have a central bank in Canada right now since 1935. We have a central bank in the United States since 1913. These are the only two nations I've really talked about in depth, so I'm just sticking with those for now. There has been no reserve ratio in the history of the Canadian banking system, and Canada also didn't have a crisis in 2008. They didn't have a crisis in the Great Depression, 1929. They didn't have a crisis in 1907. They didn't have crises at the same time that the United States had one, which was a very tightly linked trading partner. No banking failures, no banking crises. You need to ask why. And those answers aren't immediately obvious. But I do think that the system generally has a tradition of free, open, stable banking. And so that's why I'm not surprised to see this reserve ratio so low. And it's not enough to say, well, it was so low and then finally it's going to explode here. No, COVID was a one-off thing. We all should recognize that. The world definitely collectively lost its mind, and it's very tough for a lot of people in many different ways. Everybody knows that. But if COVID did not happen, who is to say that that reserve ratio would not have still been low today for Canada? One more thing, and I will show this again, looking at the 1800s in Canada as well, they had historically low reserve ratios. Even when the base money was not just these, ledger balances, these settlement balances that Canada calls them from the central bank. That is each bank's account with the central bank, as their safety buffer against their outstanding deposits. Even when it was gold, when it was a gold-backed Canadian dollar, a gold system, they also had quite low reserve ratios. And we'll talk about those in the future, but just take my word for it for now. So again, you can't immediately conclude that it's fractional reserve banking that is the problem. In fact, I don't think you can conclude that at all. And many people try to do that just by looking at the US system or just by looking at some theory. It's not fractional reserve banking, it's just banking. That's what you need to understand about that. And that's what I'm trying to show you in this video. Canada has shown, you can have relatively high reserves and have a recession. And maybe this wasn't good that they tried to do this decision system-wide. And of course, again, you have a central bank, so it's not a vacuum here. I wish I could show you a free banking system. We don't have them anymore. Again, why we need Bitcoin. But just to make the point, again, they had a relatively high reserve ratio during a time of recession, before and during a time of recession in the early 80s. And then they had an extremely, extremely low reserve ratio during the time of the financial crisis and no crisis. No banking crisis, no banks failed. And they had that all the way until COVID. Now, COVID, again, no reason to analyze this. We've talked about this. It's crazy. We'll see what will happen to Canadian inflation. It is rising, by the way. It has been rising. This is a problem for them. But this was a decision that they took, without a doubt, collectively influenced by the West. I'm not saying that they had to do it. They thought they had to do it. This is just completely outside the norm, completely different. They never had that, even during the global financial crisis. So central banks, not a good thing. Central banks are all around the world. This is why we need Bitcoin. But from the data that we do have, if you want to try to look at banking, it's not immediately clear. In fact, it's not clear at all that fractional reserve banking is what causes the crisis. There are certainly other things, and chief among them is going to be the central bank's manipulation of the interest rates. But I'll hold off on more of that for now. This is just a little bit of a flavor to show you how the reserve ratio in one country can give you quite a different conclusion than the reserve ratio in another country. And again, Canada didn't even have a legislated reserve ratio. Thanks a lot for watching. Take care.